Welcome to tonight's program, our virtual author talk with Paula Yu. As with all of our programs, we would like to start with our library land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Dakota County Library and its 9 library locations are located on the traditional and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. Dakota County resides on land that has been inhabited by the Wapakouta and Miwakatoan Dakota people and other Native nations from time immemorial. Seated in a land treaty signed in 1851, this land holds great historical, personal, and spiritual significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. And we also want to respectfully acknowledge that Dakota County Library is the namesake of the Dakota people. And by offering this acknowledgement, we work towards our value of acting inclusively and our mission of learning and recognize our collective responsibility to engage our community in the history of the lands of Indigenous people. Officially, welcome to tonight's program. We are pleased to have author Paula Yu with us tonight as part of our Asian American and Pacific Islander series. Paula is a graduate of Yale and Columbia Universities and Warren Wilson College. She's a former journalist who has worked for Detroit News, Seattle Times, and People Magazine. She's also a screenwriter whose credits include Supergirl, Mozart in the Jungle, and West Wing. And she's a professional violinist to boot. I myself am really enjoying all of her books lately, especially her teen book recently, Good Enough. And I also want to share with you that if you have any young people in your life, she has some fantastic, easy nonfiction or picture book biographies about the Sammy Lee story and Anna May Wong. So these are both books that you could check out through Dakota County Library. And I want to, without further ado, pass it on to our esteemed guest, Paula Yu. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi, well, thank you so much, Renee, and I'd like to thank everyone at the Dakota County Library for this opportunity. Looking forward to spending the hour with you, talking to you about, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I became a writer, talk a little bit about my books, and obviously focus on the Vincent Chin book, which is the new book that just came out. I'm warning you, I write everything out, so I try to be organized, but I will kind of occasionally get distracted off the beaten path, though. So Renee will remind me when we have 15 minutes left or so we don't have to pull the hook on me. I do want to add that I'm going to be presenting a keynote address. So there are images that we have to respect the copyright on. So I just respectfully ask that you do not do screen shares of any photos from my Zoom presentation. I mean, unless it's of my cat. So you know that's okay. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'd like to say thank you again to everyone for joining. So I'm going to go ahead and do the screen share now. So if you give me 2 seconds, scrolling down here, going to share, and let me hit play, and I think we are good to go. Okay, so everyone can see this, we're good. If there are any problems, Renee will let me know, but seems like I think we're good. So I want to talk about how I became a writer first. I'm going to walk you through that. It was 1976 and I was in the 1st grade, and the first book I read was Charlotte's Web. And I loved the book. I cried so hard reading it, and I knew right away I had to be a writer just like Charlotte the Spider. So I wrote my first novel, which was 75 pages long. I finished it in the 2nd grade. It took a while, but it was a 75-page novel about 2 girls that got into a fight and then made up and became friends again. So I knew it was a New York Times bestseller. So I immediately sent it to Harper and Row, which at the time published a lot of my favorite children's books. And I sent it to them, and they wrote a very nice letter back saying, "Dear Paula, you're a very talented child writer. You should try out for our short story contest for kid writers ages 7 to 10, which is wonderful, right?" Well, I ended up ripping up the letter and crying to my parents and saying, "I'm not a child writer, I'm a real writer." So the reason why I'm telling you this is, pay attention, we're going to come back to this story. And let's just say I didn't take rejection well back then. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this book, and I wanted to say that this masterpiece in children's literature, it's so universal. You know, we identify with all the characters, including Fern, the little girl, you know, and it's just one of my favorite books. But what was interesting back then was there weren't a lot of books that featured human characters who looked like me. So I'm having to identify with spiders and pigs. And I also wanted to say the other thing that happened too growing up. I'm a Gen Xer, so I was a child of the 70s, a teenager of the 80s, and a college student in the late 80s and early 90s. What Asian American history wasn't taught that much. It was maybe a sentence or two about the illegal imprisonment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, a couple of things about the Chinese Railroad, but really it was like maybe 2 or 3 lines in a textbook. It was not taught on a regular basis when I was growing up. So I wanted to show you a picture of what happens when you don't see yourself reflected in history or in English classes or in books. I used to draw myself with black hair and black eyes because I identified as, you know, being of Korean descent. And then later, I started drawing, I got obsessed with princesses, white princesses with the blonde hair. And as you can tell, I had a little bit of an identity crisis. Also growing up, there wasn't a lot of, we didn't have the movie Crazy Rich Asians or all the amazing new Asian American TV shows and actors that you see today. Back then, I grew up with magazine articles like this, promoting the model minority myth that we all played the violin, we were really good at math, and we went to Ivy League schools. And I remember being told at the time, but that's a good stereotype because it's at least positive. You're good at math, you go to Ivy Leagues. And the problem is it's actually not a good stereotype, and I'll explain why. Because this was me when I was 7. Yes, I played the violin really well. I was really good at math, and I got straight A's, and I went to 2 Ivy League schools. So yes, I did fit the Asian American overachiever stereotype and also the model minority myth. But the reason why it was toxic and negative and problematic was that it reduced my individual achievements into a monolith, and it dehumanized me and it devalued my individual achievements, which is why I wrote Good Enough, which was my first young adult novel published by, wait for it, HarperCollins. Guess what? They used to be Harper and Row. So it only took about 34 years to finally get published, and they recognized me as a real writer finally. So I kind of poke fun at my life growing up as an orchestra geek and an aspiring violinist back when I was in high school. But I also address it on a more serious level, using humor as a way to explore the model minority myth and the dangers behind it. So that was one of my books. Now I'm going to talk very quickly about my children's picture book biographies. I ended up stumbling across this article on Google. Just, you know how you're Googling and then you just end up finding some interesting article and you go down the rabbit hole. I happened to see this picture and a story from ESPN talking about how he was the first Korean American man to win a gold medal at the Olympics, even though growing up, he was forbidden from using the town public swimming pool because he was not white. And I remember thinking to myself, why is this not a book? That's amazing. I wish I knew about this growing up. So I wrote my first children's picture book biography called 60 Years and 16 Seconds, and it was published by Lee and Low Books. So I want to show you a couple of pictures. This is the real life Sammy Lee before he passed, and he's carrying 2 of the torches that he carried. One is, I think, from 1996, I think 96, and the other one is from 1984. And there's a picture of me with Dr. Lee and Dom Lee, no relation, but was the illustrator for the book. And you'll also see at the bottom, I thought it would be fun to show everyone what the gold medals look like. That's the gold medal and the bronze medal in 2 diving competitions in 1948, and then the gold medal that he won in 1952. And I wanted to show you the opening picture of this book. This is where he's on the other side of the fence because he's not allowed to use the pool because he's not white. And when I interviewed Dr. Lee, I happened to capture this picture of him looking at the same swimming pool that he used to be forbidden from swimming in. And today, of course, he was an honored guest. So I'm showing a lot of these pictures too to show you that when I write, it's not just about Googling. It's not about just going to look up articles and doing research at wonderful libraries like the Dakota County Library System, but it's also about boots on the ground, knocking on people's doors, getting interviews, talking to people face to face. So that's a lot of my journalism training, which I'll talk about in a second. So it was an honor to interview Dr. Lee for this book. Now, I'm going to take a little detour because, as Renee mentioned, by night, I write books to feed my soul. By day, I am a TV writer and producer. So when people find out I write for the West Wing and Supergirl, they suddenly want to hear all about it. So we're going to take a quick detour, but there's another reason for this. So here's some pictures when I was a staff writer on the West Wing in 2002. That's me and Aaron Sorkin. I don't know where he went. He was there, though. This is what the White House looked like on the set of Warner Brothers. And as you can see, the front part is the White House, and behind it, you can see the construction, the facade. And I love this picture because to me, this also represents not just the magic of Hollywood, how, we create this illusionary world for the viewer, but it also represents a metaphor for how I write, because you see the book. The book is the front of that White House set, but behind it is all the scaffolding, all the hard work that I did to put the book together with my reporting, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. This is me at the fake Oval Office at the fake Resolute desk, reading a fake resolution. And just so you know, we had several actual real White House speechwriters, lobbyists, and people who clerked for senators and congressmen people that were on the writing staff of the West Wing. And they all told us our White House on the Warner Brothers set was like twice the size of the real White House. So our Oval Office was way bigger than the real one. This is me in the fake war room. I'm making a fake phone call to, I guess, broker peace with North Korea. This is me and the fake President Bartlett, played by Martin Sheen. We're at a post-Emmy party, and those are real lobsters, not fake lobsters in the background. And yes, I tried to eat every single one. This is us on the front page. We won the Emmy for Most Outstanding Show for the 4th season. So if you look really closely, you can see me on the left in the red dress. And now this is just 2 quick photos from Supergirl. This is how she flies. Basically, she's on a green screen. There's a guy dressed in green that flies her around. And then this is me with one of the evil villains, alien villains on one of the episodes I wrote for Supergirl. And he actually is the nicest person in the world. And this is an episode I wrote for the West Wing I co-wrote it. It's called Han, and it was about a North Korean pianist who wants to defect on the night of his recital at the White House. And the reason, and I'm showing this to you because it was one of the first times I wrote a script that featured someone who looked like me, that is someone of Korean descent. And I was very proud of that, which is what led to my next children's book called Shining Star, the Anna May Wong story. It's about the famous silent film and also glamorous movie star of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, Anna May Wong. What was interesting about her was she was not allowed to play the wife of the farmer in the famous The Good Earth movie because Paul Mooney, who was a white actor, had been cast, so she could not play his wife because back then it was forbidden for interracial kissing on screen. Even though they're acting, it's fake, still couldn't do it. So her part was cast with Louise Rainier, who was white. And as you can tell by the makeup and the tape that they used, they basically called this yellow face, tried to make them look Chinese. And Louise would actually win an Oscar for her performance. Anna May Wong, however, was stuck playing stereotypical racist roles like Mongol slave. So she was actually ahead of her time in terms of representation matters on screen. So she really paved the way back then when she started fighting and saying, this isn't fair. I want to do non-racist, authentic portrayals of Chinese women on screen. Just very quickly going through the rest of my books, I was honored to meet Professor Muhammad Yunus. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for using economic theories of microloans, where you can get loans for very, like a $200 loan that he used in Bangladesh to help eradicate poverty. And it then spread throughout the world. And we actually have microloan systems in America as well. And this is just a picture. Remember how I said boots on the ground, got to meet the people. I had the honor of meeting Muhammad Yunus in person to interview him, and it was just a real honor. And then just very quickly, I write with Lian Lo, a bunch of writers and illustrators. We work on an early reader, diverse group of kids who live in New York City. So these are some of the books that I've written for that particular book series. Okay, now I think I'm going down here. So I am gonna start talking about Vincent Chin. So that's a little bit about my life as a writer. Now going into Vincent Chin, I want to take you back in time. It's 1993. I'm 24 years old, and I had just majored in English at Yale and gotten my master's in journalism at Columbia University. I wanted to write the great American novel, but I didn't feel ready yet. And so I thought I should write about other people's lives, kind of like Hemingway was a journalist. So I thought, you know what, let me get more experience writing on deadline, learning about the world, and doing journalism, because that's a good way into my future life as a book author. But looking back, I realize now in hindsight, there was a subconscious reason as well for me going into journalism, because having grown up, starting to think of myself as a blonde-haired princess, not seeing myself positively and accurately presented on TV and in books, I thought at that time when I was 24 that my voice didn't matter, that, no one cared. No one wants to hear stories from me or my life or being Korean American. Who cares? I'm not important. So I thought other people were more important than me. So it kind of makes me sad looking into really the reasons I went into journalism. I'm still grateful I went into journalism because it provided me the backdrop for which I pursue my writing today with books. But, it's funny thinking about it now. So when I was 24 years old, I was an intern at the Seattle Times, and I got a job offer to write for the Detroit News. And I remember thinking at the time, this is 1993. And I remember thinking to myself, but what about Vincent Chin? Because back in 1993, that was barely a decade after he had been killed and barely a decade after the civil rights trial had happened. And for those of you that may not know enough about Vincent Chin, I will walk you through exactly what happened. But basically, if you were a Gen X Asian American in the 1990s, you knew who Vincent Chin was. And in fact, a lot of my Asian American journalist friends also were like, that's great, you're going to write for the news, but in Detroit, but what about Vincent Chin? Is it safe for you out there? So that was something that I very clearly remembered. I had actually first heard of Vincent Chin when an Academy Award nominated documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin came out in 1989 that aired when I was in college. So that's how I had first heard of him. So I'm going to go, where's the next picture? Okay, so this is me in 1994, Detroit. I'm 25, and as you can tell, I haven't changed my hairstyle or my fashion choices since. And I want to start with this picture of Vincent Chin. He's about my age. He's 27 in this photo. His birthday is actually May 18th. He was born in 1955. He would be 19, yeah, he's a baby boomer. He would be in his late 60s today had he lived. So I want to show you that picture there. So now I am actually going to talk about what happened to Vincent Chin. And I think usually I read this, but I'm going to, I'm going to actually read it just to make sure it's accurate. So let me just walk you through what happened with Vincent Chin. On the night of his bachelor party on June 19th, 1982, 27-year-old Vincent Chin was beaten to death with a baseball bat by Ronald Ebens, 43, and his stepson, Michael Nitz, 24, in Detroit. This happened at the height of anti-Japanese sentiment in the American auto industry due to the increased competition from Japanese import cars and mass layoffs across the country, especially in Michigan, which was the home of the big three, Chrysler, Ford, and GM. Witnesses claimed overhearing one man allegedly shout at, it's because of you little mother F dash the expletive word that we're out of work. Although the two men pled guilty to manslaughter, the judge gave them a fine of about $3,000 each and a sentence each of 3 years of probation. Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz were white. Vincent Chin was Chinese American. This shockingly lenient sentence angered the Asian American community in Detroit. Their anger led to activism as they joined diverse forces to fight for Vincent's justice, leading to the first federal civil rights trial for an Asian American. And I'm going to go a little bit more into that in a second. And let's actually talk a little bit more about this case. And I'm trying to remember what the next picture is. I'm going to go into my research and we're going to return to the case. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail, but those are the basics of this story. So I went to a lot of libraries because libraries are awesome, and archives, including the Bentley Historical Society at the University of Michigan Library. I also worked with the National Archives in DC, the Berkeley Archives, and also the Museum of Chinese Americans in New York. This is an example of me going to the archives at Bentley. They give you a big box and you just go through everything. So here are some letters I found. Many people, because social media didn't exist back then, there were basically a ton of letters that people wrote, angry letters to editors at newspapers, to the TV news broadcast, everywhere. They're like, this is a terrible story. Here are more handwritten letters. A lot of these were written to the Phil Donahue show because they actually covered it as well. The Vincent Chin story was covered by national media back then. It was a pretty big story in 1983. This is an example of one of the court documents that I went through. I read through more than 2,500 court documents, and I'm going to show you what they look like. I organized them in binders like this. So as you can see, a lot of little, because these are not digitized. They're not, these are just actual paper transcripts. And I want to show you what I did. I made Xeroxes, and I would highlight stuff, and then I would write these little tabs. Like this one says, Cotton home run. Cotton is the name of the police officer who arrested Ebens, and one of his quotes involved the words, it was as if he was going for a home run when he swung the bat against Vincent Chin's head. So I would do this and go, oh, this is a good quote. So I would do this, and then I would manually type everything up on my computer so that way I could find things a little bit more easily. So I had to do all that kind of old-fashioned research before I then transferred it digitally onto my computer. And here are my binders, lots of binders. I have many binders. And here's my cat Oreo, who may interrupt us. I have 3 beautiful black and white cats. This is to show you the size, frame of reference. I have, I think, 3 or 4 piles of these binders. And now where am I? Okay, so now this is the article that came out about when he was killed. And this is a picture of Vincent Chin and his bride-to-be, his fiancée, Vicky Wong. I'm showing you this picture because I ended up in the book meeting Jared Lew. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jared Lew now. Jared Lew is a young photographer, millennial, living in Detroit. What happened was when I started doing interviews for this book, I met Corky Lee. We will talk talk about Corky a little bit more later in this program. But Corky Lee is a famous Asian American photographer. For the past 50 years, he's chronicled Asian American history. He was there when the protests happened in 1983 for Vincent Chin and took photos. He also took many other famous photos of iconic Asian American historical events that happened in the past 50 years that I will talk about in a second. But anyway, I interviewed Corky and asked, and some of his pictures are used in my book. And I said to him, I said, he told me, when you go to Detroit, you should meet Jared Lew. He's a talented photographer. He can help take pictures as you do your research. And he also is a relative. He's related to Vincent Chin. I said, oh, great. So when I met Jared, I asked him, I said, so I hear you're related to Vincent Chin. How are you? And he said, my mom is Vicky Wong. And that's when it was a record scratch. And I realized, I was like, I'm throwing everything I wrote, I'm throwing it out the window. We're starting from page 1. You're my book. And he became the emotional spine of my book. There are 2 storylines in my book if you haven't read it. One is I go chronologically through the Vincent Chin killing, the case that it spawned, the aftermath of the verdicts. And parallel to that is Jared's story of how he finds out about how his mom was related to Vincent Chin. What happened was, and this starts in the opening of my book, it's June 19th, 2012. It is the 30th anniversary of the killing of Vincent Chin. And his cousin called and said, dude, it's the 30th anniversary. It's the big one. Don't talk to your mom about that guy. And Jared was like, what guy? And his cousin's like, Vincent Chin. And Jared said, who's Vincent Chin? And his cousin was like, oh my God, you have to go Google this right now. So when he put in the words Vincent Chin, this is the first thing Jared saw on the internet. And he said, I recognized my mom right away. And so the story for Jared is, how does he work up the courage to talk to his mother Vicky Wong, about the worst day in her life, and also knowing that he wouldn't be here today if Vincent Chin had lived. So Jared felt this great responsibility and this weight on his shoulders to make sure that he lived up to Vincent Chin's legacy. So it's a lot about, does he talk to his mom? What happens to Jared on his emotional journey? And because my book is aimed for young adult readers, I did write my book for everyone. I write out the word mother F dash, I spell it out. I do not sanitize, I do not censor in my book, but I felt that although I wrote this book for everyone, having Jared as a focal point in the book makes this, I think, more emotionally engaging for teen readers because they used typewriters back then. They used telegrams, not texts. They didn't have social media. Jared is kind of like the guide for the teen reader. So I thought it was very important. I'm very grateful to Jared for being so open and honest and raw with me on this emotional journey for both of us. And in fact, I'm his unofficial Korean auntie. I care for him very deeply, and I'm so proud of all that he's accomplished as a photographer. So now I'm going to talk about the actual case. So here's Vincent. As he was the OG millennial. This is him as a very young baby boomer. This is his best friend. He met Gary Koivu when they were in the first grade. They were lifelong friends. They grew up together. So of course he called Gary and said, let's do an impromptu bachelor party. So him and Gary and two other friends, Jimmy Choi and Bob Sorosky, ended up going to the Fancy Pants Club, which was an adult entertainment nightclub with women dancers. So I want to show you, this is, oh, I'm just trying to share. How come I can't share? Hang on, sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry, there was a little bit of a lag there. This is the Fancy Pants Club. Back in the early 1920s, it was a movie palace. It was where all the rich people went to see movies back in the 1920s. And then during hard times, it then was turned into an adult entertainment nightclub with dancers. This is a screenshot from Who Killed Vincent Chin of what the Fancy Pants Club looked like. And this is the bat. I'll go into that in a second. So let me, while Vincent and his friends were at the bachelor party, a man named Ronald Evans and his stepson, Michael Nitz, were on their way to see a Detroit Tigers game. But as they were driving to Tiger Stadium, they heard on the radio the Tigers were being decimated. They were losing 10-3 to the Milwaukee Brewers. So they turned the car around and they just said, okay, let's just go home. They were having a father-son bonding night. They turned the car around, they see the Fancy Pants Club, and they impulsively decide, hey, we're still father stepson bonding. Let's go in and it's last call. Let's grab a beer. So they end up sitting across the catwalk from where Vincent and his bachelor party were sitting. Words were exchanged. There was a lot of drinking. There was a lot of toxic masculinity going on, and allegedly racist slurs such as the words chink and jab and nip. People testified on the stand that they heard those words coming from the direction of where Ronald and his stepson were sitting. One thing led to another. Vincent got out of his seat, went over to where they were. An argument ensued. There was a huge fight. Chairs were thrown. They're all kicked out of the nightclub. Out in the parking lot, the fight escalates. Ronald Evans pulls a baseball bat out from the trunk of his car. Why did he have a baseball bat? It's because Evans and Nitz were baseball fans, because as you knew, they were going to see a Tigers game. They also played in an adult amateur baseball league. So and also Michael Nitz growing up was he was a talented athlete, avid baseball player on his high school team. So that's why the bat was in the car. So he pulls it out. Vincent Chin realizes, I got to get out of here. This fight escalates. He runs down Woodward Avenue. His friends jump in Jimmy Choi runs after him. The other two friends, Gary and Bob, get in their car to try to rescue and find him. And then in the meantime, Evans and Nitz also get in the car and drive away. They all end up, Evans and Nitz reach Vincent and Jimmy Choi, who ended up catching their breath and waiting outside a McDonald's just down the street, hoping that Gary and Bob are going to pick them up. Meanwhile, Evans and his stepson are driving down that same road. In court testimony, they claim that they were on their way to a hospital because during the fight at the nightclub, a chair hit Nitz on the head and he needed stitches. His head was bleeding. They claim that they just happened to see Vincent and Jimmy sitting outside, and that triggered Evans. He got angry and he pulled the car over, and then the fight continued, and that's when he beat Vincent into a coma. And then 4 days later, Vincent Chin was taken off life support and died on June 23rd. On June 29th, one day after his wedding was supposed to take place, there was a funeral, and the wedding guests attended the funeral instead. Now I'm going to show you some more pictures. This is the baseball bat that was used. This is the McDonald's where they ended up, and these are the two police officers that arrested the men, and that's the spot where Vincent fell over into a coma. This is a picture of the grave site. This is his mother, Lily Chin. This is a picture from one of the memorial services that happened years later. Now, what happened was, because I'm just looking at the time here to make sure we're good. Okay, what happened in the early 1980s was, as you know, I was talking about the auto industry was going through a free fall. No one was buying their cars. They were laying off everybody. And Detroit at the time was known as the homicide or the murder capital of the world because they had one of the highest homicide rates in the country at the time. As a result, prosecutors were physically unable to attend every single hearing because the court system was that overburdened. So on March 16th, 1983, there was a hearing for Ronald Ebens and Michael Nitz. They had originally been charged with second-degree murder, and because of the overburdened court system, the attorneys for both sides plea bargained it down to manslaughter because they realized you're definitely guilty of manslaughter. It's probably going to be easier to convict you guilty of manslaughter and get you in jail versus second-degree murder because there were no iPhones back then. There was no, it was only he said, she said witness testimony, and they figured a second-degree trial, second-degree murder trial might be harder to get jail time. So they said, guilty, manslaughter will get you jail time. Unfortunately, the prosecutor's office was unable to attend the hearing. Judge Charles Kaufman heard limited information, and based on that information and based on the fact that Ebens and Nitz had never done a crime before, he felt mercy for them and said, these are not the kind of men you send to prison. They're not going to go out and do this again. I'm going to give them 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine each. And the famous quote that he said was, Judge Kaufman said, let the punishment fit the criminal, not the crime. And that immediately did not go over well with a lot of Detroit, especially the Asian American community. And this is Lily Chin and her family and friends. They were very upset by the sentencing, as you can tell. And then it hit the media. Everyone started writing about it. Now I want to bring you back. Remember how I said that there were mass layoffs? This is an example of a photo of the long lines of people trying to get jobs. I mean, it was really bad back then. And because of that, people needed a scapegoat. Instead of the American auto industry saying, you know, we dropped the ball, we should have stopped making such big gas guzzlers because it's the 1970s and 80s. We had an oil crisis. Gas prices were going up. We were in a recession. Maybe we should have thought of trying to make smaller, more fuel efficient cars instead of just churning out these huge gas guzzlers. As a result, Honda, Datsun, Toyota, those cars started outselling the American cars because they were smaller and they were more fuel efficient. So as a result, instead of taking accountability for dropping the ball, a lot of auto worker unions and auto workers started having fundraisers where for $1 each, you could bash the crap out of a Japanese, or what they would call a Jap import car. And so it was basically xenophobia, racism, and scapegoating, and trying to find a victim. And in fact, a lot of politicians used racist rhetoric. They started saying things like, one politician referred to Honda as quote unquote, the little yellow people. He would later apologize for that, but he shouldn't have said that term in the first place. So I wanted to show you some of this. And I know this sounds a little familiar. Kung flu, coronavirus, China virus, we'll be talking about that. History is kind of repeating itself again, but this happened not that long ago. So a bunch of Asian Americans got together. Helen Zia is one. She was an activist and a journalist, and she actually worked at the Chrysler stamping plant for a few years as well. So she knew life on both sides. This is Jim Shimura, one of the lawyers. And then this is one of the elders of the Chinatown community in Detroit. They all got together and they formed the American Citizens for Justice. And so what that did was they started protesting. So it led to a bunch of protests. They were joined by the Black community, by churches and synagogues, by a very diverse group of people where they all formed a coalition to protest. Now, here's the thing. Because Ebens and Nitz pled guilty and were found guilty and sentenced guilty for manslaughter, they could not be retried for the same crime. That would be known as double jeopardy. So these protests and their investigation, the American Citizens for Justice found Racine Colwell. She was a young professional dancer at the Fancy Pants Club. Racine testified that she overheard Ebens allegedly say, "It's because of you little mother F word that we're out of work." And that clearly was not the smartest thing to say, optically speaking, given the rise of anti-Asian sentiment in Michigan and across the country because of the so-called trade war with Japan over these cars. So this is Lily Chin and Helen Zia. Lily Chin went from crying to being angry. She started speaking out. She started influencing and impressing a lot of politicians, including, if you look back there behind her, is Jesse Jackson. He ended up also joining the cause, as did Congressman Conyers and many other people. And then this led to the big protest. I'm just looking at my time here. Looked at the protest for Vincent Chin in 1983. And like I said, they didn't have Twitter. They couldn't just, send out a Zoom invite, they, or post an angry tweet or Instagram post. They actually printed out flyers and handed them out. This is the protest. So I'm just showing you some pictures that Corky Lee actually took of the protest. And as you can see, it's estimated between 500 to 1,000 Asian Americans showed up in Detroit that day to protest. This led to the Department of Justice taking notice. There was an FBI investigation. There was and there was federal indictments. There were 2 indictments that happened. And this is Lily Chin with Assistant Attorney General William Bradford Reynolds in Washington. I have a chapter called Mrs. Chin Goes to Washington. So I just loved her story of going from a quiet, mother just getting excited for her son's wedding to becoming the world's most unlikely activist. I mean, she was a badass. She was very impressive. So then that led to the new trial, because they realized we can't try them again for the killing of Vincent Chin, but we can try them for violating Vincent Chin's civil rights. So both Ebens and Nitz were charged with 2 counts of violating Vincent Chin's civil rights. Number 1, conspiracy. Number 2, preventing Vincent Chin from enjoying the place of a public accommodation, the Fancy Pants Club, on account of his race. This is the first time we've ever had a civil rights trial for an Asian American for violating their civil rights. So this was a huge case. So now I want to show you this picture. This is Judge Anna Diggs Taylor, and everybody had a really interesting life story. For her, in 1964, she went to Mississippi to help register African-American voters. And that was right when 3 activists, 2 young white men and 1 young black man, all 3 of them were activists. They were murdered by the KKK. So she was there in 1964 in Mississippi at that time. So it's incredible. And that led her journey, going from being a lawyer to becoming the first federally appointed Black female judge on the federal bench in Michigan by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. So I thought that was actually really incredible. Going back to Judge Charles Kaufman, I do want to say that he was shot. He was a fighter pilot during World War II, and he was shot over, during the war, and he was a prisoner of war at a Japanese POW camp for 2 years. And because of that, that's what led to his feelings of mercy. He actually, Ebens and Nitz were not the only ones that he gave 3 years probation to. He did the same for other defendants, including Black defendants. He considered himself very liberal, so he was shocked when everyone said, "This is racist what you did, this is wrong." And that really haunted him, because he didn't realize that his decision would be so controversial. Now, this is Ebens and his then wife, Juanita, going to the trial. This is the stepson, Michael Nitz, also going to court. What happened during the case? There was one question. Was this a racially motivated killing, or was this just a case of too much drinking and toxic masculinity gone awry? In the first federal trial in 1984 in Detroit, the jury acquitted Michael Nitz. He was found not guilty on both counts, but the jury decided Ebens was guilty of violating Vincent Chin's civil rights. So he was found guilty of preventing Vincent Chin from enjoying his bachelor party at a place of public accommodation, the Fancy Pants Club. Unfortunately, there was a technical error. There was accusations of alleged witness coaching. I interviewed all the witnesses and most of the witnesses, and in testimony and in my interviews, they have all denied ever being coached. But due to that technical error, the U.S. Sixth appeals, it's very hard to say, but anyway, the appeals court agreed and they ordered a new trial. So a new trial was ordered. It happened in May of 1987. And this time that technical error was just enough to open up the door to clear Ebens. So the guilty verdict was overturned. He was found not guilty. So to this day, both Ebens and Nitz are legally and technically not in violation not guilty of violating Vincent Chin's civil rights. However, it's still a difficult story because there's also talks about what is racism. Is it only that you have to wear a KKK robe? Is it that you have to be found guilty in a court of law? What about splitting hairs? There's a lot of technical things that happen in these court cases. Was there internalized subconscious internalized racial bias? We'll never truly know, but this case brings up all these very important points that should be discussed in the classroom. Now I just want to go back very quickly. I'm going to wrap up now. I'm going to show you some pictures from the past and the present. This is the Fancy Pants Club. This is the Fancy Pants Club today. I actually went on the anniversary, June 19th, 2018, when Vincent, Ronald, and Michael all met. This is the club today. I ran up those stairs. My husband and Jared, who's taking photos, they yelled, they got scared. They're like, "What are you doing? You might fall in." Luckily, I didn't fall in, but this is what I found when I ran up the stairs. Lucky I did not fall into that part of the club. And then just as you can see, plants are growing inside the club. This is a picture Jared took of me taking a picture of the club. Afterwards, we got in the car, we drove down Woodward Avenue because as a writer, I wanted to emotionally know, physically, like boots on the ground reporting, what it was like to run or just to travel from the Fancy Pants Club to the McDonald's. So this is the drive that we took going down following Vincent's footsteps. This is the McDonald's. And then this is the McDonald's today. This is the restaurant where Vincent Chin used to work at, and it's now a hipster restaurant. This is the old Chinatown in Detroit. And I want to go back to Corky Lee, the photographer that I mentioned earlier. He took a lot of iconic photos from back then. This is the very iconic photo he took from the 1983 rally. I wanted to bring him up because Corky Lee did, among his photos, his most famous photo was in 1896 when the Transcontinental Railroad met in the middle of the country. This is the Golden Spike photo that they took where all the laborers, the railroad workers, got together for a celebration photo of the completion of the railroad. You'll notice a bunch of people are missing. Who's missing? Chinese laborers. What I mentioned before, Vincent Chin's great-great-great-grandfather was one of those laborers. He's not in that picture. And what's interesting is that back in the day, in the 1800s, dynamite was very, very volatile. So the railroad companies preferred having the cheap Chinese laborers carry the dynamite because they figured their lives were not as valuable as the white laborers. So it's estimated between hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese laborers were killed to make this railroad, and they're not in this picture. So in 2014, Corky Lee got the descendants, the sons, the daughters, the aunts, the uncles, the great-grandchildren, the grandchildren, got everyone together to reclaim this photo. And we've been talking a lot about how Asian American Pacific Islander history is missing in our classrooms. And in fact, Illinois just announced that it's now mandatory. You have to teach Asian American history in depth in K through 12 classrooms. And this is an example of us trying to reclaim our history. This is Corky Lee. And the reason why I'm bringing him up again is because he sadly passed away from COVID-19 in January of this year. And just it's because of him that I met Vicky Wong's son. So I just wanted to honor his memory. And what's interesting is Jared Liu is so influenced now that he's trying to take over the mantle, and his photos have been published in a lot of places, including the New York Times. So we see the new generation. We see this carrying on. Speaking of carrying on the generations, the young people today, you saw those photos from the 1980s of the protests. Look what's happening today. Asian Americans have always been protesting, but nobody knows about that. Nobody sees the photos. There are black and white photos from the 1960s of Asian American college students marching arm in arm with the Black Panthers. We've been protesting for decades, but no one is keeping a record of that. And I think today's generation is making sure this history doesn't disappear. And we talked about the anti-Asian racism happening in Michigan. And I'm looking at the time, I think I'm going to wrap up in a little bit. We talked about how the baby boomers were young back in the 80s. They protested. They influenced Helen Zia, Jim Shimura, Roland Huang, all these amazing Asian American activists, paved the way for what happened today, for us protesting now, because anti-Asian racist bias crimes and incidents have risen dramatically. And just to let you know, today, the Stop AAPI Hate organization, which monitors hate crimes, they have now announced that earlier It was about 3,800 hate crimes had been reported since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic of March 2020. As of today, May 6, 2021, that number has risen to over 6,300. It's doubled in less than a year, and in fact, in just the past few months. What happens with these protests, as with Vincent Chin, these protests led to the passing of a resolution against anti-Asian sentiment during COVID-19. There is now a law that might happen. The COVID-19 hate crimes bill is now being considered by the House. It was passed by the Senate. The House is considering it, and President Biden has announced that he will pass it into law if the House passes it as well. So I want to show that you can make a difference with these protests, even if you're not a politician or anything like that. I do want to go back very quickly to Vincent Chin and say that his case did have tangible effects, even though we lost the battle in terms of the war against racism. Because of Vincent Chin's case in Michigan, you can't plea bargain from second degree to manslaughter anymore. And now prosecutors have to be at all hearings, and victims' families are allowed to read a statement of impact at the hearing. And back then, Lily Chin wasn't even told that there was going to be a hearing. She got the call later from a relative saying, they just had a hearing. And she goes, what? No one called me. Because of that, because of Vincent Chin, because of Lily Chin, victims' families are told ahead of time, we're having a hearing, come and read a statement and tell us how your lives were impacted by the death of your loved one. So as with this new bill that hopefully will go through, we can make a difference, and we will continue to make a difference if we speak up. People will listen. So to honor the baby boomers who paved the way for what's happening today, this is Gary Koivu. This is him today. So he's a wonderful man. He's incredible. This is Morris Cotton, the officer who arrested Ronald Ebens. This is him today. He was the first Black chief of police at the Highland Park Police Department. This is Van Ong. He was the nurse that tended to Vincent Chin at the ER. This is him today. This is Jim Shimura, one of the lawyers, and Roland Huang. This is them today. They're still fighting. They're still speaking out. You can read interviews with them today. They're doing a lot of Zoom panels these days as well. So they're still fighting. And this is Mabel Lim. She's mentioned in my book. She was one of the people who handed out the leaflets back then. Today, I think she's probably, I don't know if she has a Twitter page, but she knows how to send emails. This is Helen Zia. This is Helen Zia today, just an incredible role model and activist who's continuing to speak out and fight on justice for against all forms of hatred. And I also want to talk a little bit about solidarity. The Black community, Jesse Jackson, Congressman Conyers, they all helped bring awareness to the Vincent Chin case. So we're also trying to do that as well, because it's not just about anti-Asian racism. It's about Black Lives Matters. It's about protecting the LGBTQIA community. It's about, helping the deaf community, helping all different diverse communities, the Me Too movement for women. That's what we should be doing. We should be all together. And I want to talk finally about Atlanta. As you know, Atlanta happened with the 8 people who were killed. And I just want to bring up, it broke my heart with Atlanta. I'm going to wrap up by saying that when I interviewed everybody for this book, Vincent Chin had died almost 40 years ago. Every single person I talked to cried. Some openly wept, were unable to talk. And they acted as if Vincent had been killed the day before. And I realized they were all in their early 20s, early 30s when this happened. This was a seminal, profoundly traumatic event that affected them for the rest of their lives. And I realized not only did they have to suffer the trauma of a loved one being killed, but also not finding justice, being told you don't count when it comes to the discussion and the dialogue on racism. It wasn't racist, you don't count. So to have that type of trauma, I realized when I was interviewing everyone, they were not remembering what happened. They were reliving it. I was witnessing trauma happening. We were no longer in Gary's house in Michigan. We were outside the Fancy Pants Club in 1983. So that really profoundly affected me. And when Atlanta happened and the killer said, oh, I was having a bad day, this was not a crime of racism. This was, I had a sexual addiction, and everyone's saying, oh, this wasn't a bias crime. I'm going to tell you now, the loved ones of the 8 people who were killed in Atlanta, 40 years from now, whoever writes the book on their story, they're going to be reliving what happened, not only the traumatic death and horrific mass shooting trauma that happened to their loved ones, but they're also going to have to relive the fact that they were told once again, you don't count. You don't count. There's no such thing as anti-Asian racism. You just don't count in this conversation. And that's why I wrote this book. And that's why I think we need to be teaching this in our schools. And look at what's happening today. You saw those 2 photos. And just going to wrap up. Here are the grave sites for the family. They're together, which I think is very moving. And they're in Michigan. This is the mile marker that inspired the title, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, for my book. And this is the mural. There are 2 murals that are on the back and front cover of my book. Unfortunately, this building, which was abandoned, was demolished last month. So I'm actually glad we were able to capture these images before they disappeared. And then this is a famous photo of Lily and her son, Vincent. And I think that's it. I'm wrapping up. And I just want to say thank you. And let me hit escape and stop the share. And here we go. Hi, I'm back. Okay, thank you so much. I hope I didn't go over my time. So Renee, you can take over.
So I'm pausing because what you have given us, Paula, in this program is such a gift. I myself have read this book, and I highly recommend all of you to check this out. The gift of this program, the gift of Vincent's story to a new generation, to a country, a world that didn't know his story. I want to thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being present here today to take all of this in and to be a witness, right? You were really sharing so much with us, but we witnessed through your story, through your storytelling tonight, Vincent Chin and his life and his impact, and it is immense. So thank you so much, Paula, and thank you all.